1 and type 2 errors. They have two different kind of errors. I'm going to, where do I want to write? Where can we see? I'm going to do that. So, when I'm doing my testing, I have my null hypothesis and I have my alternate hypothesis. If, I'm going to do that this way. If my null is true or if my null is false. If I reject the null, if I reject the null and the null is false, that would be the correct thing to do. If I reject my null and my null is false, that's correct. If I reject the null, but it was actually true, they're going to call that a type 1 error. If this decided not to write, why, oh why? We'll do it this way. If I don't reject the null, in other words, I accept the H1 instead of the H0. If I don't reject the null, and the null was true, that's the correct statement. I would accept the HO if it were true. And if it were false, then that's when I get what they call a type 2 error. So, that table's in your reading and in your notes and whatever. They're going to give us this word problem. First thing they're going to have us do is figure out what our null hypothesis and our alternate hypothesis is. Then the type 1 and the type 2 errors. So, some college graduates employed full-time work more than 40 hours a week. Some work fewer than 40 hours a week. We suspect that the mean number of hours worked per week by college graduates is different. If it's different, then I'm going to say that it is not equal to 40, right? If it's different than 40, it's not equal to 40. So, this is going to be my alternate hypothesis. They're going to have you select U does not equal, and then the little drop down, you'll use the 40 hours. It's different than 40. That means my null is going to be that my mean does equal, and again, I'll pick the 40 out of my drop down. So picking out my null and my alternate hypothesis. So it says, in this context, what is a type 2 error? So if it's a type 2 error, you don't reject the null. 1, my null is false. So here again, you're going to have a drop down. It's going to say failing to reject. I can't write that small. Failing to reject the hypothesis that, and then I'm going to put the null in there, so I'm going to use my mean is equal to 40, when in fact, the mean does not equal 40. So if it's a type 2 error, we don't reject the null. So we're going to say we failed to reject it. The null was when it was equal to 40. When in fact, it really did not equal 40. Now, if we were going to, suppose we decided to reject the null hypothesis. If we rejected the null hypothesis, then we would be making a type 1 error. So if we reject the null, then it's a type 1. If we don't reject the null, it's a type 2. And that's basically what we're picking out from our table. Whoops. Now that my pen decided not to write, I got to hop back and forth here. Oop. So on number 5, a coin-operated coffee machine made by a big corporation was designed to discharge a mean of 7.1 ounces of coffee per cup. If it dispenses more than that on average, the corporation may lose money, and if it dispenses less, the customers may complain. Believing that the mean amount of coffee dispensed by the machine is different, is different from 7.1 ounces. So if it's different, the mean is not going to equal 7.1, right? Again, that's the alternate statement. So my mean does not equal 7.1 would go in for your H sub 1. The equal is always your null. So my mean equals 7.1 would be my null. This one, it asks for the type 1 error first. The type 1 error is rejecting the hypothesis that the mean is equal to 7.1, when in fact the mean is really not equal to 7.1. A type 1 error is when we reject it when the null equals when it's really not equals. Suppose that he decides not to reject the null hypothesis. If I decide not to reject the null hypothesis, then I'm making the other kind of error, the type 2 error. So my type 1 error is when I reject my hypothesis. My type 2 when I fail to reject my hypothesis. So number 6, a consumer advocacy group is doing a large study on a car rental practices. Among other things, the consumer group would like to do a statistical test regarding the mean monthly mileages of cars rented in the U.S. this year. The consumer group has reason to believe that the mean monthly mileages of cars rented in the U.S. this year is less than last year's mean, which is 2,750 miles. So my mean is less than 2,750. Again, that one does not have the equal to symbol with it, so that's my alternate hypothesis. You have it as the null if the equal would be with that. So my mean is less than 2,750 is your alternate hypothesis. Your null hypothesis then is your mean would be greater than or equal to the 2,750. It's got the equal to in it, that's the null. So this time we're going to do a type 2 error. A type 2 error, we failed to reject. It doesn't want to write. Right? If it's a type 2 error, we failed to reject the null. The null is that the mean is greater than or equal to the 2,750, when in fact the mean is really less than my 2,750. Type 2 error, failed to reject. Type 1 error, the group decides to reject the null, if I decided to reject the null, I'm making a type 1 error. All right, because this is annoying me, I'm going to restart the computer.